following scripture quotations are taken from the Holy Bible, New Living Translation, with copyright by Tyndale House Foundation, used by permission of Tyndale House Publishers, all rights reserved. Hi, welcome to my channel. I'm Peachy Pie, and this is a mini applause for you. Why do you get a mini applause? Because you're amazing. And why are you amazing, you might be thinking? Because you made it through yesterday and you made it through today. Whatever you're going through, you made it through and you are here right now. And since I have faith in you, you're probably going to make it through to tomorrow. So why don't you hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you can be here when I post another video. Okay, today we are going to be talking about abusers. And we are specifically going to be talking about reformed abusers. So please take this as your trigger warning. We are going to be talking about abuse reform and rehabilitation, and in order to do so, we'll have to talk about the abusive actions, which may include financial abuse, physical abuse, emotional, psychological abuse, child abuse, animal abuse, even substance abuse in some cases. So please take this as your trigger warning. If you're not comfortable with this kind of material at any point in time, you are welcome to pop off this video. I do have other content, and there's the entirety of YouTube for you to retreat to. But thank you for being here. So I've paraphrased these stories due to copyright and fair use issues, but the title is a trick. You can't do anything. If you're a victim, you can't do anything to change your abuser. If you could, that would mean that you were the problem. You have to accept that it's not your fault, nor is it your responsibility to make your partner change. So an article from the Wall Street Journal says, men who successfully reform or are at a stage where they can accept that they have a problem and are motivated to make a change, says Dr. Edelson of the University of California, Berkeley. The men who try to get help probably still want to stay with their partner and save the relationship. The longer the victim can stay separated from the abuser, the more motivated the abuser will be to change because they're afraid that the victim will leave them for good. Barbara Gillen says that in order for the rehabilitation to be successful in the long run, the following 5 things need to be present. Number 1, remorse or guilt for harming their partner. Number 2, responsibility. They need to understand that they are 100% responsible for their own actions without blaming anyone or making excuses. Number 3, they must motivate themselves. Number 4, they must have the willingness to examine and understand the effect that abuse in their childhood has had on them. And number 5, they must have an understanding that all bullying types of behavior, including violence, must be stopped. So the best thing victims may do is report the abuse and leave the abuser. That in and of itself is dangerous for the victims, considering the risk of murder after leaving can be as high as 75%. If abusers want to change, they will put the effort into their own recovery. The same way you can't force or coerce an addict to choose the right path, you can't force or coerce an abuser to change their behavior. You may have to accept the reality that the person you thought you loved is gone and perhaps was never there to begin with, or the person you currently still love will probably never stop abusing you. So I've compiled a bunch of abuser recovery stories, and an article from The Guardian tells the story of Rob, which begins in 2006. His business was failing, he and his wife were arguing frequently, and he was suicidal and may have been suffering from depression at the time as well. While in his car thinking about ending his life, Rob put on a recorded message from a pastor addressing the congregation. Rob, who was a devout Christian, said, and he said just something, it was, "Do you love your children?" And I answered in the car, "Yeah, of course I do." And then he said, "Would you die for them?" And I said, "Yeah, I would." And he said, "Well, this is Australia and you'll probably never have to die for your children. But if you're willing to die for them, why won't you change for them?" And when I heard that, I just thought, wow. Rob remarks that this was the moment he realized he needed counseling, though his wife Deb disagreed. She said that the real reason he went into counseling was because she had just rejoined the workforce and Rob, who had been controlling her throughout their marriage, was not coping well, though neither of them realized that he had issues with control to that extent at the time. Within a few short weeks of Deb starting her job, Rob had a nervous breakdown, was suicidal, experienced anxiety and panic attacks, developed a prescription drug dependency, and lost an enormous amount of weight. This, she says, is what she believes led to his attending counseling, and Rob agrees. In his first session with the counselor, he was confronted with a series of questions which first opened his eyes to his abuse. The counselor showed him the diagram for the cycle of abuse, showed him how his behavior was actually typical domestic violence, then told him to take it home and talk to his wife about it. Though he wasn't physically violent, he acknowledged that he behaved exactly like a perpetrator. He financially abused his wife by keeping total control over their bank accounts. He bullied and often criticized his wife, sometimes using humor to demean her. He tried to stop her from having a career and made it difficult for her to see friends and family. The message that he was sending her was the equivalent to, "I'm the boss, you do what I say," which encouraged the mentality that she was only there to serve him and his needs. Just about the only thing atypical of Rob's situation was the fact that he reached out for help himself without any provocation. Rob points out that both he and Deb herself had no idea that their relationship was indicative of domestic violence. She remembers that when Rob had the discussion with her and showed her the cycle of domestic abuse diagram, Rob acknowledged that he didn't abuse her with his fists, but instead abused her with his emotions to keep her under control. Deb was shocked to discover that what was happening in her relationship was actually abuse, but when her eyes were opened, she started to see the signs of it in relationships of other people all around her. It took them 10 years and a lot of intense counseling, but Rob and Deb are now happily married and are both domestic abuse counselors. Deb as a career choice and Rob more informally assists abusive men who approach him for help. Another story from The Overwhelmed Brain by the creator of Love and Abuse podcast, Paul Kolayani, says, "The hardest part about learning to spot emotional abuse is that often the abusers will appear to be kind, caring, and generous. Because of that, it's easy to be tricked by them. They show one face to the world and another at home. They seem authentic and genuine but become another person when they know no one is watching." Paul then admits that his behavior was that of a highly judgmental person who withdrew his emotions if he didn't get what he wanted, manipulating his language in a way to make his partner feel guilty about herself and encouraging her to feel worthless. He admits to coercing his partner into believing she was wrong and that she should blame herself rather than him for his actions. He says with deep regret that he knew exactly how to get her to accept those deceptions within her mind. Until his wife divorced him, he states that he was controlling and manipulative of every woman in his life. When his wife finally went for a divorce, that was the wake-up call he needed. It was at that time he realized that he needed to start looking within himself for the source of his relationship problems. He says that what became clear to him was that every relationship he had been in had eventually become a failed relationship. Though the relationship would begin well enough, each partner would over time distance themselves from him and eventually end the relationship. At the time when he and his wife had separated, he decided to look at why all of his relationships had failed and noticed that he was the only common denominator in each failed relationship. If he didn't figure out why his relationships were failing, he realized that he would be unlikely to ever have a successful relationship. He started to wonder what he was doing wrong. Separation was probably the best thing for him because with no one else around to blame, he could finally start to look in the one place he had never looked for the source of his problems, within himself. An article from the News Hub shows the story of Victor Matai, the founder of Safe Man, Safe Family, an organization that tries to help abusive people end their abusive cycles. Vic says that since he grew up with violence, he thought that violence in the home was normal. He mentioned that violence was all around him, from his home to school to even church. He remarked that violence was also called love. "I was literally told every time I got a hiding that it was done to me because I was loved. This was love. This is love. And it is done to me because I love you and this love comes from God," Vic said. When he became a parent himself, violence was still a part of his home. Calling to memory the incident which prompted his change, Vic said his 8-year-old daughter was running late for school and didn't want to go, so he picked up a shoe and started beating her with it. When she further resisted, despite the beating, he started hitting her with the heel of the shoe. When his wife arrived home and he confessed to the beating, she argued with him, took the kids and decided to go to an abused women's shelter. At that time, his 8-year-old daughter started to blame herself. She felt that he was angry because of her. This confused him because he never took the blame for the abuse onto his own shoulders. It was at this point he and his family decided that he needed to get some help. Once he joined a program called Stop, his beliefs were tested. I walked in on the first day and the counselor said to me, "Is there anything that would stop you from completing this program?" And I said, "Yes, there is. Yes, there is." I looked at these 16 or so men in the room. I looked at them all in the eye and said that if any of you touch any of my kids, I will effing kill you. Almost half a year later, he was sat down by the program's leader, who asked him why he didn't kill himself. He responded aggressively by wrestling with the counselor. Once the counselor had managed to calm him, the counselor asked him who touched his kids and who gave them a hiding. As he had previously stated that he would kill anyone who touched his kids, the counselor repeated, asking him why he hadn't then killed himself, considering that he was the one who had touched his kids. At that moment, Vic realized that his opinions and belief systems surrounding abuse were incorrect. He subsequently began working to help himself and others. He agrees that it can be difficult for abusers to step forward and get help, but encourage them to do so even if they feel misunderstood. Vic says that though he may still have some issues with violence, he now has other more constructive ways to deal with his problems than resorting to violence and abuse. An article from The Atlantic titled Confessions of an Abuser has the following two anonymous accounts. Even before reading an account of a toxic relationship, John had been having epiphanies about his role of an emotional abuser in his relationship. Though the relationship had ended 5 years prior, John acknowledged that he felt ashamed that it had taken him so long to see the situation clearly. He agrees that it was probably because he was in denial of accepting that he was an emotional abuser, because his beliefs about abuse had exempted him of that title on account of him not being physically abusive. He felt that he was not abusive at the time because he had never caused physical harm to anyone. This thought pattern allowed him to dismiss any concerns or complaints his ex had as her being over-emotional or overly sensitive. He agrees that he wasn't willing to accept that he was anything other than the nice guy who looked good on paper to everyone, including his ex. As a result, he was completely oblivious to his role as an abuser, and rather than accepting guilt for his action, he instead recast his guilt as a form of victimhood. At the time, he also labeled the whole relationship as toxic, but says that he can now see that the relationship was toxic because he was the one who made it so. I was overly critical about almost everything, and I failed to maintain a proper sense of perspective on both the relationship and on life in general, so that a dent in the floor or a banana peel in my car became things that enraged me and justified my criticism and emotional abuse, John says. John says that the night they broke up, his eyes began to open. Of that night, he said that though he'd recurringly had issues with depression and anxiety, when his ex had decided to leave, he convinced himself that he was suicidal. He later acknowledged the truth, that it was more like he was trying to manipulate her into staying with him. She called the police because of the suicide threat, but once they found out that he had interfered with her ability to leave the apartment by blocking the door, they arrested him for false imprisonment. Later, he thought this was something he deserved and that it was necessary, though his acceptance of his role was something that only came after many years. Immediately following the arrest, he felt police had overreacted and that he wasn't abusive because he hadn't physically harmed his ex. He basically felt that he was not guilty of any abuse. Unfortunately, his friends and family supporting him only encouraged this delusion by defending his actions and encouraging him to hire a lawyer, so it took him even longer to understand that his actions were abusive, even if it wasn't physical. After the arrest, John's life fell apart. He received a wake-up call that he calls a welcome check on his ego and arrogance. Unfortunately for most victims of emotional abuse, John admits, the average abuser probably never experiences this kind of reckoning, and I think that the absence of this allows many emotional abusers to continue to justify their behavior to themselves and consequently to continue to act in the same way without learning from their past mistakes. The second anonymous confession states, Max suffered from borderline personality disorder. At the time when he and Sarah met, he was a frequent alcohol abuser. His addiction stemmed from his recurring issues with depression and anxiety as a result of his own physical and emotional abuse issues with his parents as a child. Sarah herself had some severe mental health issues, depicted by a history of low self-esteem, eating disorders, and other methods of self-harm, including such as cutting. She had also had a negative childhood experience. He had felt at the time that they were a match made in heaven. During his relationship, Max admits that he felt Sarah was overly sensitive. It's not because it's true, he says, and to be honest, I don't think there really is such a thing as being oversensitive. What was really happening was that when my ex made any kind of emotional demands on me, it was simply too taxing for me to bear if I wasn't already in a stable place, which I really was. I didn't have the coping skills or emotional strength to deal with someone else's negative emotions on top of my own, so I lashed out. Max confesses that he believes that the lashing out was okay because he thought he was finally prioritizing his emotional needs, but in reality he was lashing out because he had no healthy way to satisfy his emotional needs. He clarifies that people who suffer from borderline personality disorder often think in black and white terms. Because of their stunted range of emotional expression, they may think of situations and people as either entirely good or entirely bad, and switch easily between the two, swiftly, oftentimes without warning. Sometimes Max would think of Sarah as an angel who was entirely perfect, then suddenly switch to thinking of her as an evil element trying to ruin his life. He would believe this wholeheartedly and convince himself that he had just not seen her for who she was prior to that thought. When he abused his ex, Max acknowledged that he genuinely believed that his emotions reflected his reality, and that no matter how awful his actions were, they were entirely justified. Max admits that BPD is a struggle as he cannot honestly trust his own thoughts and feelings. When he is upset, he might break things or hurt the people he loves, and once his self-loathing episode is complete, he would have to do damage control in his home and relationships. He says that he cannot trust his gut because his gut is now not an accurate representation of reality. While Max agrees that Sarah was abusive in some ways too, he firmly states her behavior does not justify or mitigate his. Even if she was abusive, it was never okay for him to reciprocate. Though Max and Sarah ultimately split up, Max says he wishes her the best for her new relationship and thinks of her fondly. He admits that she deserves to have a loving and stable relationship that he should have given her initially. As for myself, he says, I am exorcising my demons, developing healthy ways of thinking, and letting my life guide me one day at a time. So, what have we learned as victims? Number 1, you can't change the abuser. They have to change themselves. And number 2, the best thing you can do is probably to leave, even if it is the hardest thing to do. Number 3, we've learned that there's not nearly enough emphasis on abuse rehabilitation for abusers in our society. If we don't fix this, abusers will keep abusing. And that leads us to our scripture of the day, which is found in Ephesians 6 verse 4, which says, Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger by the way you treat them. Rather, bring them up with the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord. That's a very apt scripture, if I may do say so myself. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you have had a phenomenal weekend. Are you ready for Christmas? Well, I am certainly not. But anyway, thanks so much for being here. I hope that you have a wonderful day further and enjoy the last few hours of your weekend. Bye.